We continue now at the top of Daf Samid Beis in Meseches Zevachim. This is Zevachim Daf 89b. The Gemara says, Menohani mili, from where do we know this? Rashi explains, Menohani mili, the dam chatos kodem ladam ola. The Mishnah said that when it comes to the applications of the blood of the chatos, that comes before, that takes precedence to the application of the blood of the ola. But on the other hand, it says, ve'evore ola, that the burning of the limbs of the ola on the mizbeach, kodmen le'more chatos, that takes precedence to the burning of the sacrificial portions of the karban chatos. So how do we know that? And the Gemara says the Tanu Rabbanon, because the rabbis taught, Uparsheni ben Bokar tikach lechatos. It says you're going to take a second bull for a chatos. The full pasuk, V'lakchu par ben Bokar uminchaso soles belula vashamen. Uparsheni ben Bokar tikach lechatos. They're going to take a par ben Bokar and a mincha, and then a second par for a chatos. Rashi explains, Uparsheni ben Bokar bechinuch halavim ksiv. This pasuk is by the inauguration of the Levim, beBahaloscha, Parshas Bahaloscha, and so it says in the pasuk again, Parsheni ben Bakar tikach lechatos, and so im bo lelamed shehen shnayim. Now, if the point over here is to teach that there are two that are being brought, Harei Kvar Nemar already says that in the pasuk. It says v'oso eso echad chatos v'eso echad ola. It says one is going to be a chatos and one is going to be an ola. And the full pasuk over there, pasuk a little later, says v'halavim yismuchu es yadeim al rosh haparim. The Levim are going to lean upon the bulls. V'asei eso echad chatos v'eso echad ola. One is a chatos, one is an ola. LaHashem, to Hashem, L'chaber al Levim, to be an atonement. And Rashi explains, Kvar Nemar ba'osa parsha. It says in that parsha, V'yoso eso echad chatos. It says that one is a chatos. Reisha dekra, V'halavim yismuchu es yadeim. In the beginning of that pasuk is as we just saw, V'halavim yismuchu es yadeim. And so therefore that's already written. It says, Eso echad chatos v'eso echad ola. So Ma Talmud lomor ufarsheni ben bakar tikach l'chatos. Why does the pasuk say, Ufarsheni ben bakar tikach l'chatos? And the reason is as follows. Sheyochol shehei chatos kodem l'chol ma'isa ola. One might think that a chatas fully takes precedence over anything involving a karban ola. Talmud lomar ufarsheni ben bakar tikach lechatos. It says that parsheni ben bakar tikach lechatos. Rashi explains yochol tikdom chatos laola l'chol ma'aseh. I might think there's absolute precedence of the chatos to the ola. Kedechsiv v'aseh achad chatos v'eso achad ola. Again, like it says in the pasuk, one is a chatos, then is an ola. The chatos seems to be first, so that's why the pasuk says Ufar Sheni, Mashma Shehei Sheni Lo. That's understood that in some ways, again, the Parsheni, the Chatos, is actually secondary. That's what it means. Ufar Sheni Ben Bokar Tikach Lechatos. And so the Gemara continues. I Parsheni, if it said only the pasuk of Parsheni, Yochote Ola Kodemus Lechatos L'chol Maseh. One might think that the Ola always takes precedence to the Chatos. Talmud Lomer, the pasuk says V'aseh Eso Echad Chatos V'Eso Echad Ola. Again, we have the other pasuk which puts the Chatos first. Haketzad, how so? Dam Chatos Kodemes Ladam Ola Mipnei Shemerat. So again, the blood of the Chatos, that takes precedence over the blood of the Ola because it is Meratza. Again, it affects an atonement. And the Gemara continues, a Vare Ola, when it comes to the limbs of the Ola, again, the limbs of the Ola, they take precedence to the sacrificial portions of the Chatos. And we will take a look at the Hagos HaBach. The Bach adds in the words that a Vare Ola, again, the Vare Ola take precedence over the sacrificial portions of the Chatos, Mipnei Shein Kalil, because they are totally consumed. Again, the Ola is totally burned. And then the next word should be Ve'ema Matana Kamaisa. Now we'll continue in the Gemara. The Gemara says, Ve'ema Matana Kamaisa. Why don't we say that the first application of the blood of the Chatos, not all the applications, it's really only the first one that creates the Kapora. So that first application of the blood, the Mechaper, which is the atonement, tikdom, that should take precedence over the application of the blood of the ola, v'hanachlo, but the rest of them, maybe we shouldn't say that. Rashi explains, matana kamaisa dechatos mechapra. It's the first one, the first application of blood, that's the kapara, v'sholma kapara b'didah, and that actually is the end of the kapara. Kedamrin b'perak be'shamai, like we say earlier in perak be'shamai, the chiper, it says it's an atonement, afal pishalonit and alachas, even though there was just one application. And the Gemara continues and answers, Amar Ravina says, Hacha b'chatos halaviyim askinon. Here in this pasuk, again, we're talking about the chatos by the inauguration of the Leviyim. And therefore, v'afagav dechi ola dami, even though that particular chatos is sort of similar to an ola. The reason it's similar to an ola is there was no sin involved in that particular chatos. That was different than a normal chatos. And still, Kamar Achmana, he tikdom. Still, the pasuk says he ticked him that it should come first. And therefore, if in this case, where it's not even being brought for a sin, it comes first. That means that by chatas in general, all applications of the blood should come before the applications of the blood of the ola. And the Gemara continues with another answer. B'ma'arava Amri, in the west, they say, Hoel v'hiskul b'matanas gomer. Once you already start the applications, you should finish the applications, and therefore you wouldn't just say that the first application of the chatas comes first, but really all of them take precedence over the applications of the blood of the carbon ola. And Rashi explains, Dechi ola damya, again, the chatas of the Levium was really like an ola. Shalo heviyu al chet, it wasn't brought for a sin. V'afilu achid kodem lo ola, nevertheless it took precedence to the ola. Mishum d'shem chatas kodem li ola, because in general chatas comes before ola. V'hu adin legimel matana shebechatas, and the same will be true for the three applications, the other three applications of the carbon chatas. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. Iboy luhu, they had the following question: Dam chatos ve'ivore ola. Let's say you have the blood of a chatos, and you have the ivorim, you have the limbs of the ola. Eza mehen kodem, which one of those come first? Dam chatos kodem. On the one hand, we could say that the dam of the chatos, the blood of the chatos, comes first. Memnei shemaratza, again, because that affects acceptance for a sin, as we said. Odilmer, maybe ivore ola kodem, maybe the limbs of the ola should come first. Memnei shehein kol alishim, because those are totally burned in the fires. And the Gemara says, Tashma, come in here, the following proof. It said in the Mishnah, Dam chatas kodem ledam ola, that the blood of the chatas comes before the blood of the ola, and we can infer the ledam ola hu dekodim, the dam chatas comes before the dam of the ola, but leivore ola lo kodim, but the dam chatas does not come before the limbs of the ola. But the Gemara says, Adarab, on the contrary, mi seifa, you can learn from the seifa the opposite, from the end of the Mishnah. It says, Eivore ola kodem leimure chatas. It says the limbs of the ola come before the sacrificial portions of the chatas. And we can say, they come before the sacrificial portions of the chatas, but l'dam chatas lo kadim, they don't come before the blood of the chatas. And so the Gemara says, no, rather you can't see anything from the wording of the Mishnah. And Rashi notes, a murei chatos lo mechapri. First of all, the sacrificial portions of the chatos are not a kapara. Shein kapara ela bedam, because kapara atonement is specifically only through blood. And dam ola, when it comes to the blood of an ola, lav kolil, who that we don't call that kolil. Dein kolil ela beishim. Kolil is by the fire, something that's burned in the fire. Avol mikoach kolil kasi. However, it does come from the strength of something that is kolil. Shohaivorim yu kolil, because again, the limbs, they will be kolil, they will be totally burned. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. Iboilu, they ask the following question: Dam ola ve'imurei chatos. Let's say you have the blood of the ola and the sacrificial portions of the chatos. Eza mehen kodem, which of those come first? Dam ola kodem dekasi mikoach kolel. We could say the blood of the ola come first because they come from the strength of something which is kolel, which is what Rashi just mentioned. Odilma, or maybe imurei chatos kodmen, maybe the sacrificial portions of the chatos come first. Dekasi mikoach mechaper, they come from the strength of something which atones. Again, as Rashi just mentioned. And the Gemara says, Tashma, come here, proof from the Mishnah. Dam chatas kodem ledam ola. It said that dam chatas comes before the dam ola. Dam chatas hu dekodem ledam ola. So the blood of the chatas comes before the blood of the ola. Avol emurei chatas lo. But when it comes to the emurei chatas, that is not the case. And the Gemara again says, Adarab, on the contrary, miseifa, look at the end of the Mishnah. You can infer the opposite. Evore ola kodem leimurei chatas. The limbs of the ola come before the sacrificial portions of the chatas. Evore ola hu dekodem leimurei chatas. It's only the limbs of the ola that come before the emurei chatas. Avol dam ola lo, but the blood of the ola not. And again, the Gemara says, Ela meha leka lamashma mina. We can't see anything from the wording of the Mishnah. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. Iboilu, they had the following question: Dam ola v'dam osham. When it comes to the blood of the ola and the blood of the osham, eza mehan kodem, what comes first? Dam ola kodem dekaasi mikoach kolel. The blood of the ola comes first because it comes from the strength of something which is kolel. Odilma dam osham kodem, or maybe the blood of the osham comes first to mechaper because it's an atonement. And the Gemara says, Tashma, coming to the following proof: Dam chatas kodem ledam ola. The blood of the chatas comes before the blood of the ola. Avol dam osham lo, but you can infer that the blood of the osham would not. And the Gemara says, Bedinu diboy lemisni dam osham. It should have said dam osham as well. V'aydi diboy lemisni seifa evore ola kodem leimurei chatas. But since it's going to say in the Mishnah that the limbs of the ola come before the sacrificial portions of the chatas, diitana leimurei osham, over there, if it would have said instead of emurei chatas, it would have said emurei osham. Havo amina. Then I would have said the following incorrectly. I would have thought leimurei osham hu dekadmi leimurei chatas lo kadmi, that maybe they only come before the emurei osham, but not before the emurei chatas. So mishamachi tana chatas. So maybe it's for that reason that it says the word chatas. And the Gemara says, Tashma, come in here, the following proof. We said in the Mishnah, chatas kodem liyasham. The chatas comes before the yasham. Chatas hu dekadmi liyasham. It sounds like the chatas comes before the yasham. Aval ola lo, but the ola does not come before the yasham. My lav dam, and can't we infer imur that we're talking about the blood? And the Gemara says, no, not necessarily. We're not necessarily referring to the blood over here. Imurim, we might be referring to the sacrificial portions. Dekonami, we can infer that to Katani mipnei shedam moniton. It says because the blood is applied, and so therefore that's where blood is mentioned. Shma mina. So you see again, we're referring to the imurim over here. And Rashi explains, Shedam Monita, the Mishnah says that its blood is applied. Alma be'emurin kai, you see that the Mishnah is dealing with emurin and not with blood. The ibadam kai, because if we're talking about blood, Shehini tanis miboile, it should have said that it, because we're already dealing with blood. It won't need to say the word dama. Saying the word dama implies we have not been dealing with blood, we have been dealing with emurin until now. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Chatos kodemes, that a Chatos comes before an Asham. The Gemara asks, Adrab, on the contrary, Asham kodem, the Asham should come first. Shekein yesh lo kitzva, there's a minimum fixed value for the Asham. It has to be 2 shekel. That's not true by a Chatos. And the Gemara says, Afilu hachi, nevertheless, riboy de mizbeach adif, the fact that it's more applications of blood to the mizbeach, that takes precedence. And the Gemara continues at the two dots, Asham kodem letoda, the Asham comes before the Toda and before the ram of the Nazir. The Gemara says, Adrab, on the contrary, HaToda ve'el Nazir kadmi, we should say, that a carbon Toda and the ram of the Nazir, they come first, Shekein tun and lechem, because they require loaves that accompany the carbon. The Gemara says, Afilu hachi, nevertheless, Kadshe Kachim, Adife Asham is in the category of Kadshe Kachim, the more sanctified kinds of karbanos, and therefore the Asham takes precedence. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Toda ve'el Nazir, that the Toda and the ram of the Nazir come before the Shlomim. The Gemara says, Adrab, on the contrary, Shlomim kadmi, the Shlomim should take precedence. Shekein yeshnam b'tzibur, because there's such a thing as a communal Shlomim. Kiviyachid, it exists with the community just like the individual. The Gemara says, Afilu hachi, nevertheless, nechalon liyom echad adifi, the fact that there's less time when it comes to the Toda and el Nazir, they're just eaten for one day, that is something that is greater, so it takes precedence. The Gemara continues, Iboilu, they have the following question, Toda ve'el Nazir, let's say you have a Toda and the ram of the Nazir, Eza mehen kodem, which of those come first? Toda kidma shekein tuna dalid minei lechem, on the one hand we can say the Toda comes first, because it requires 4 different kinds of loaves. Odilmar, maybe el Nazir kodem, maybe the ram of the Nazir comes first, shekein yesh imo damim acherim, because there's other bloods that are brought, the Nazir brings other karbanos. And the Gemara says to that, Tashma, coming here the following proof, Brisa says the answer to this question, Zu kodemis lazu shazu teuna dalid minei lechem, this one comes before this one, because this one requires 4 types of loaves. That's the Toda, requires 4 types of loaves, so it comes first. But when it comes to the El Nazir, there's only 2 kinds of loaves, and that's why the Toda comes first. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Hashlamim kodmin lebechor. The shlamim come before the bechor because of various requirements that go along with the shlamim. The Gemara says, Adrab, on the contrary, bechor kodem, the bechor should come first, shekein kedushas rechem, because it's sanctified from the womb, v'nechal kohanim, and it's eaten by kohanim. The shlamim can be eaten by the owner as well. The Gemara says, Afilu hachi mitzvahs yiseiros adifi. Nevertheless, there are more mitzvahs that accompany the shlamim, and therefore that takes precedence. And the Gemara continues at the two dots, ha-bechor kodem, the Bechor comes before Meiser Behema. The Gemara says, Adrab, on the contrary, Meiser Kodem, we should say the Meiser Behema comes first. Shekein Mekadesh Lefanav Uliachrav, because we say before and after there can be Kedusha, meaning let's say the 9th animal or the 11th animal, if they're called, referred to as the 10th animal, so they actually have that Kedusha. So we should say Meiser Behema is stricter, or Meiser Behema is more sanctified. The Gemara says, Afilu hachi, nevertheless, Kedusha Meirecham Adifa, the fact that it's sanctified from the womb is greater. And the Gemara continues, Meiser Kodem Liofos, Meiser comes before, Meiser Behema comes before bird karbanos. The Gemara says, Adarabba, Ofos Kadmi, on the contrary, we should say the birds take precedence, Shekein Kadshe Kachim, because they're the types of karbanos that are Kadshe Kachim, they're of greater sanctity. The Gemara says, Afilu hachi, nevertheless, Min Zevach Adif, the fact that it's something that is slaughtered, that is greater. And Rashi explains, Yesh lo kitzva, the Yasham has a minimum fixed value, l'damav, in terms of how much it has to be worth. T'chsib bekesef shkolim, it says 2 shekel. Aval chatas kolduk, a chatas can be any amount. Shlomim yeshnam b'tzibur, there's such a thing as a communal shlomim, like the kivsei atzeres, the lambs of Shavuos. Damim acherim, when it comes to Nazir, there are other bloods, meaning chatos va'ola, boin imo chova, chatos and an ola comes with him as a chova. Zu kodemes is lezu, this comes before that. Le'el minei ayri v'toda ve'el nazar. We're talking about the toda and the el nazar. Which one comes first? The toda comes first because of 4 kinds of loaves. And then we said by meiser behema lefanav u'liachrav, there can be holiness before and after. The Tanan, as we learned in the Mishnah, kara la tashi asiri ve'lasiri tashi. If he calls the 9th one 10 and the 10th one 9, u'liacharos or asiri, then he calls the 11th one 10. Shaloshtan mikudash, and they all have the kedusha. V'alfinan bebechoros mikrai. We learned that out in bechoros from Sukkim. And shekain kodshei kodshim, they are kodshei kodshim. When we say they are kodshei kodshim, what we mean to say is afilu achilas adam shebehen, even those portions which are eaten by people, but kodshei kodshimu, but it's in the category of kodshei kodshim. Again, there are karbanos that are in the category of kodshei kodshim, and for example, it has to be eaten within the azara of the Beis HaMikdash. And the Gemara continues, Amar Ravina Bar Shila. Ravina Bar Shila says, Emurei Kachim Kalim, the sacrificial portions of Kachim Kalim, those are the parts that are supposed to be burned on the Mizbeach, Sheyatzu Lefnei Zrikas Damim, let's say they leave the Azara before the throwing of the blood. Again, the throwing of the blood is the matir, that's what permits it, so to speak, to be burned on the Mizbeach, so it's not yet in the category of Me'ila until the Zrikas Damim, but here, even though this is Lefnei Zrikas Damim, it's not yet in the category of Me'ila, still Psulin, it's still disqualified if it leaves the Azara. And Rashi explains, Psulin is disqualified, even though as far as Me'ila is concerned, Lefnei Zrikas Damim lo Kadishi, before the Zrikas Damim, before the throwing of the blood, it's not considered to be consecrated. It doesn't have that holiness. But Le'inyan, if Sule biyotze, Kachei Kachim Ninu, but in terms of the disqualification of Yotze, those Emurim are considered like Kachei Kachim. And the Gemara continues, Vitana Tuna, our Mishnah supports this as well, because what does our Mishnah say? Our Mishnah says that if you have the animal carbon, that takes precedence over the bird carbon, mipnei shehu zevach. It says because it is slaughtered, because it's slaughtered with a knife. And then it says, v'yeshno kodshei kodshim damov ve'emurin. It says that when it comes to the animal carbon, when it comes to the meiser behema, which is what was being discussed, so over there, both the blood and the emurim are kodshei kodshim. When it comes to a bird carbon, it's just the blood that goes on the mizbeach, but there's no emurim that go on the mizbeach. And so now, what is this Mishnah indicating? Bishlama emurim. Now I understand sacrificial portions, less nubofa, so that doesn't apply by birds. Eladam, but when it comes to the blood, mioise, that does apply by birds, as we said. And so what is the point of the statement of saying dama ve'emurim? Really, the Mishnah should have just said the emurim are kachei kachim, because the dam, that's not something that it has over the bird karbanos, that's true by both. Elalav kamash malon, rather, isn't the Mishnah teaching us that emurin kidamo, that we should compare the sacrificial portions to the blood, madamo lifnei zrika, just like the blood before zrika has that status, af emurin kodem zrika, so too the emurim, the sacrificial portions, it's also, we're talking before the zrika, v'kakari lu kachei kachim, and therefore we're referring to it already as kachei kachim. Umadamo mifsal biyotze, and just like the blood, if it's taken out of the azara, it becomes disqualified. Af emurin mifsal biyotze, so too the sacrificial portions of kachim kalim, again, even before zrikas damim, they become disqualified through yotze when they leave the azara. And Rashi explains, Vitana Tuna, Vitana Tana Didon, meaning the Tana of our Mishnah, Sayata Lamilsa supports this. And again, the Gemara said, Eladam mihoisa, what are you mentioning blood for? The blood exists by Ophos on the Mizbeach. V'lo havale lemisni eleva emurav kachei kachim. It should have just said that the sacrificial portions of the Meiser Behem are kachei kachim, Masha ein kain b'Ophos, and that's not true by birds. Elo lahachi nakadamo b'hadei emurav. The reason why we're grouping the blood with the sacrificial portions, Lashminan dechi hadadi kachei b'shah. We're trying to say that they're similar. That at the time this one is kachei kachim, the other one is also called kachei kachim, meaning to say even before zrika. Just like the blood is disqualified when it leaves the azara, so too the sacrificial portions, because again they refer to as kachei kachim. And the Gemara continues, name a Messiah. Let us say that the following Machlokas Amoraim supports Ravina Bar Shila, again, that a Murei Kachim Kalim, that leave the Azar before Zrikas Damim, that they are disqualified. The case over here is as follows, Besar Kachim Kalim, let's say the meat of Kachim Kalim. Now the meat of Kachim Kalim are eaten in all of Yerushalayim, and after the Zrikas Damim again is the matir, that's the permitter. Now one can take the meat outside the Azara, and in all of Yerushalayim that meat can be eaten. So if you have the meat of Kachim Kalim, what if that meat of Kachim Kalim, it leaves the Azara before the Zrikas Damim? Then what is the status? On that we have the following Machlokas Amoraim. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Kasher, Rabbi Yochanan Yochanan says it's kosher, it is still kosher in such a situation. Reish Lakish Amar Pasul, Reish Lakish says it's disqualified. And the Gemara explains the machlokas. Rabbi Yochanan Amar kosher, Rabbi Yochanan says it's kosher. Hawil v'sofo lotzes, because in the end it's going to leave the azara anyway, so even before zrika, if it leaves, it is not disqualified. Reish Lakish Amar Pasul, Reish Lakish says it's disqualified because adayin lo higia zmano lotzes, it's still not the proper time for it to leave the azara. And the point over here is that there's a machlokas here not about the emurim, but about the meat. So adkan lo pligi ela bebasar, the whole machlokas here is just by the meat. Avol be'emurin lo, but it sounds like by emurim there's no machlokas, and there presumably everybody would agree that they should be stricter. Everybody would agree that lifnei zrikas damim, it's going, if they leave the azara, they're going to be psulim, they're going to be disqualified, like Ravina Bar Shila says. And the Gemara says, "Hu adin tvei emurim nami pligi." It could be that by the emurim as well there would be the same machlokas Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. V'ha dekam miflagi bebasar, and maybe the reason why they had the machlokas by meat is lo diacha kocho de Reish Lakish. Maybe it's to tell the strength of Reish Lakish that even by the meat, Reish Lakish says pasul. Diafilu basar the sofa lotzes, even the meat which in the end will be taken out of the azara. Amar adayin lo higias mano lotzes. Still, he says that it is not yet the time for it to go out. And the Gemara continues, Lema ketanoi, let us say that this issue is a machlokas tanoim, what Ravina Bar Shila is saying about the emurim. It says in a braysa, emurei kodshim kalim sheyatzu lifnei zrikas damim, if you have the sacrificial portions of kodshim kalim that leave before the throwing of the blood. Rabbi Eliezer Omer ein moalin bahen. Rabbi Eliezer says that there is no me'ilah in such a situation. And Rashi explains, Hachi Garsinan, this is the proper text. Besar kodshim kalim sheyotze lefnei zrikas damim chutz lekloim. Again, the meat of kodshim kalim that they leave the kloim, the curtains of the azara, before the zrikas damim. So we had a machlokas amoroim. And hoel v'sofa lotzes, according to Rabbi Yochanan, the Gemara gives the reason, because it's going to leave anyway, that's why it's kosher. Shareachi loson b'chol ha'ir, because it's supposed to be eaten in the whole city. And Reish Lakish's argument, the Gemara says, is because lo higias manu lotzes, it's not yet the time for it to go out. Dakati lo it's not yet permitted to be eaten because you haven't thrown the blood yet. And the Gemara then said, Adkan lo pligi, elababasar, the whole machlokas by the meat, ba'uhu, the machshir Rabbi Yochanan. There, Rabbi Yochanan says kosher, mishum de sofo lotzes, because in the end it's going to leave the azara anyhow. And then the Gemara said, no, hu adin devei emurin, it could be that by the emurin, the sacrificial portions, machshir, maybe they would argue there also, and Rabbi Yochanan would say kosher there also. Shezrika osa kadshe kachim, because maybe it's only the zrika that makes it kadshe kachim, but again, before the zrikas damim, it's in the category of kachim kalim, and it would not be disqualified if it leaves the azara. V'hai de parish mishum de sofo lotzes. Now, if we're going to give that explanation, so that would mean that Rabbi Yochanan, the real reason why he says it can leave the azara is because the zrika hasn't been done yet. It's not in the category of kadshe kachim. So then, what was this reason of sofo lotzes? That was the reason given specifically by the meat. Rashi notes v'hai de parish mishum de sofo lotzes. When the Gemara explains Rabbi Yochanan that it's because in the end it's going to leave anyway, hashas kamafarish. That was the Gemara explaining Rabbi Yochanan. V'lo milsei de Rabbi Yochanan. That wasn't actually the words of Rabbi Yochanan, and therefore, again, this alternate explanation is possible. And then the Gemara said, let us suggest it's a machlokas tanoim, and the Brisa talks about the emurei kachim kalam sheyatzu lefnei zrikas damim, essentially the same case as Ravina Bar Shila, and Rabbi Eliezer says there's no me'ilah in that situation. Again, when it comes to the emurei kachim kalim, there's generally going to be me'ilah after the zrikas damim. There's not going to be me'ilah before, but here the case is that they went out of the azara before zrikas damim. So Rabbi Eliezer says, ein moalin behen, there's no me'ilah, meaning afilu la'achar zrika. What Rabbi Eliezer is saying is that in such a situation, there's no me'ilah when it left the azara, now even after zrika. Delo mahanya b'hu zrika, because the zrika is not going to be effective. The zrika is what is koveya, that is what establishes that there's going to be me'ilah, but in this case where the emurei kachim kalim, they left before the zrika, so now the zrika is not the lo mahanya b'hu zrika lahachi lemikveinu b'me'ilah. The zrika is not going to be effective to establish me'ilah over here, and that's what Rabbi Eliezer means when he says ein mo'alin bohen. And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Tzadi Amid Aleph.